And what we then see is a carbon emission this is over the next 400 years. We see a massive amount of carbon emission that would last way into the 22nd century, and that would also give rise to a dramatic temperature increase in this model of above 5 degrees warming. But of course, that's not actually going to happen, because what we've already seen is that renewables have been dropping in price about 50% per decade over the last 30 years. Even if they continue at a much lower rate of about 30%, it's still likely that they'll become competitive around mid-century. And so what this actually shows us is just the 30% solar increase tells us, yes, we'll continue to use more and more fossil fuel up to a point when solar power actually starts becoming competitive, and then suddenly we'll start using less and less. And actually, even with this very moderate assumption, we'll stop using fossil fuels by the end of the century. Not very surprising. I mean, if solar power is cheaper than fossil fuels, of course our kids, and especially our grandkids, will shift over. Sure, there's a lag period, and sure, there's transition cost, but eventually, of course, we will shift over. And just to give you a sense of it, I mean, it's not like we don't have we'll have a problem actually supplying the world. Actually, the current efficiency of solar panels, if we just use that, we could supply the entire world with all its energy needs if we put out solar panels on what would be the equivalent of 2.6% of the area of the Sahara. Of course, in my book, I also write that this is just an example, right? But it hasn't, the criticism also has been so virulent that some people actually wrote an article and saying that was totally unrealistic. Just think about all the wires. But the idea here is, of course, to say that what's likely to happen is that we will see a situation where we'll stop using fossil fuels simply because solar power comes online. And now, solar power may actually not end up being the future choice. Who can actually reasonably predict what's going to happen 100 years ahead? But it's at least one backstop technology that we do know will happen. It could also be fusion. It could be something we haven't even thought about yet. But what it means is that we'll get a much lower temperature increase. And my point is simply to say that we've heard a lot of, you probably all heard that the climate panel tells us that temperature is going to increase somewhere between 1.4 and 5.8 degrees. Most people then assume that they're sort of nicely distributed between those two. It's not. All the major scenarios are distributed towards the low end. So what we're actually seeing is a distribution like this. But most newspapers, of course, tell us the high end. What I'm simply pointing out is the high end is only possible if we continue to use massive amounts of fossil fuels way into the 22nd century. And that is unlikely to happen. It's much more likely that we'll get one of the median outcomes from the IPCC, which is 2 to 3 degrees warming. That is by no means an inconsequential warming, but it's a much more realistic assumption of what's actually going to happen. And if that is the case, then we have to also face up to the issue that global warming of 2 to 3 degrees will basically harm the third world. The IPCC technical summary actually said that 2 to 3 degrees warming will not net affect the developing world, but it will harm the third world. The politician rewrote that. Now you can't really read the sentence because they obviously didn't like that statement. But the main point here is to say this is basically about the third world. This is going to harm the third world. Let me just show you one way of putting this, but of course there's many different ways we could look at it. This is just the consequences for agriculture. If we see, this is probably going to happen somewhere around 2080. If we look at agricultural production just with temperature increase for the world, the effect will be a net decrease of about 11 to 20%. Of the world's agricultural production. By 2080, we would probably have about 100% increase in production. So what we're really saying, let's just say this for illustration purposes, what we're really saying is that instead of seeing 100% increase, we'd only see an 80 to 89% production increase by 2080. But of course, carbon dioxide also actually fertilizes, and we also need to take into effect that people actually change. Light adaptation, meaning that farmers will say, whoa, gee, it's gotten warmer, maybe I should plant earlier. And moderate adaptation, farmers saying, gee, it's gotten warmer, maybe I should plant something else. Both of these assumptions seems fairly accurate to make over the next 80 years, right? So what we're likely to see is actually, and this is the IPCC, their own judgment, is that basically we're not going to see a change in agricultural production all in all. But, and this is of course the important point, the industrialized world is going to win and the developing world is going to lose. Now, the reason why I show you this is, of course, this is one of the most studied parts, and it's also a very important part for the developing world being able to feed themselves. But perhaps it's also, but it's also just an illustration of the real issue here, namely that the developing world will generally lose for two reasons. Partly because the developing world is basically a place where it's already pretty damn warm. I mean, Denmark might actually benefit from some global warming. I've certainly heard some New Zealanders saying the same thing here, but whereas Sudan might not, right? And likewise also, and probably more importantly, most developing countries have very poor infrastructural capacities, so basically dealing with all the problems that will come from global warming is going to be much harder for them. So the idea here is to say, again, it underscores the idea that generally developed countries will both get pluses and minuses. Probably it'll overall cancel out for developed countries, but it will certainly harm third world countries. And this then poses the question of saying, are our solutions actually adequate? Well, take a look at Kyoto. From now on, I'm actually going to assume that Kyoto works and Kyoto will actually do all it says, and that the US would also participate in it, and that we would have no carbon leakage, that is, no companies moving to some countries outside of the Kyoto Agreement, which are all fairly strong assumptions. But let's just go with them. Most people have the sense that Kyoto, in some strange way, actually will address a large amount of the global warming problem. Not so. This is just one model by one of the lead authors from the 1996 UN Climate Panel report, but all models show the exact same qualitative outcome. Basically, if we don't do something business as usual, we get this temperature increase over the next, this particular model show that we get this temperature increase in the black line over the next 110 years up till 2100. We'll get a temperature increase, we'll get a temperature increase of 2.1 degrees here. But Kyoto is not going to stop that. It's not that we're not going to have any warming. If everybody implemented Kyoto and they stuck to it the rest of the century, we'd get a slightly less warming, so we get the red line, or we'd actually in 2100 get a temperature increase of 1.9 degrees instead of 2.1. Perhaps more clearly to state it, what we actually see is that the temperature that we would have gotten in 2094, we've now postponed till 2100. So the guy in Bangladesh who has to move in 2100 because his house gets flooded can now wait till 2106. I mean, it's a little good, but it's not very much good, right? And the idea is, of course, to ask ourselves, sure, if we could do all things in the world, we should also do Kyoto, but is this really the best thing to do? Well, of course, it depends on how much it costs. But just to give you a sense of that cost, I would argue that we could spend our resources much better. This is the average of all the macroeconomic models that have looked at the cost of Kyoto. Depending a little bit on the trading assumptions here, it's totally unrealistic that we'll get global trading within the next 10, 20 years, but we'll get somewhere between all countries, all the Annex 1 countries, all the industrialized countries signing up to Kyoto to no trade. The cost is then going to be somewhere between $150 and $350 billion a year starting in 2010. And this is US dollars, right? Again, this is no small amount of money. We're talking about basically, right now the world gives totally in development aid about $50 billion. So we're talking about 3 to 7 times the global development aid to help the developing world very little 100 years from now. I'm simply arguing we could do much better than that. Just to give you one example, we could solve the single biggest problem in the world once and for all for the cost of Kyoto for just 2010. We could give clean drinking water and sanitation to every single person on this planet. That would save 2 million lives each year and save 500 million people from getting seriously ill. And that would just be the cost of Kyoto in 2010. In 2011, we could solve the second biggest problem in the world, and then in 2012, we could solve the third biggest. The point here is to say, is this really a good use of our resources? And the funny thing is that nobody asked that question. I would argue that it's very much because we thought we had the gun to our heads. So of course we got to do Kyoto. No, of course we got to do something for the developing world. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we should do it the most ineffective way we can possibly help them. If we can do much better right now and actually help them being much better able to handle the problems that will come in 2100, whether we want it or not. And of course, the other idea is to also say we need to make sure that we eventually stop using fossil fuels. One of the most efficient ways would be to increase research and development. Right now, in renewables, right now the U.S. spends about $200 million per year on renewables. Increase that tenfold, and it would still just be about 1% of the cost of Kyoto for the U.S. Yet it would probably do much, much more good in the sense it would bring forth a couple of years at least the day when we switch over to renewables, and that would do much more good than Kyoto could ever do. The idea here is, again, to get a sense of proportion, to ask ourselves, what is it we should actually do? And now, of course, I'm just giving you an example, but actually all the major cost-benefit models in the world tells us that doing very much about global warming is just simply not a good deal. Why is it we don't hear that? I'm sure if they had told us the other thing, we would have heard